Leave the house, Mom. My son thought the $10 million inheritance was his, until he begged me to forgive him. One night, rain pounding outside, I opened the door to find him on his knees, shattered, pleading for mercy. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Grief has a strange way of distorting time. The day of Richard's funeral stretched endlessly, as though the air itself had thickened, refusing to let me breathe. I stood by the casket numb, while mourners offered polite condolences in hushed tones. Some spoke of Richard's generosity, others of his sharp business sense, but all I heard was the echo of silence that his absence had left in me. My husband had been the anchor of our family, a man whose presence filled every room he entered. Without him, I felt untethered, like a boat drifting on dark waters. Yet even in that moment of raw sorrow, I noticed something unsettling. While I wept quietly, my son Ethan barely lifted his eyes from the floor. He hugged me stiffly, his embrace cold, as though fulfilling an obligation rather than comforting his mother. His gaze, restless and calculating, wasn't drawn to the casket or the altar, but to the people in attendance. Each time an old business partner leaned over to whisper to another guest, I caught the flicker of greed in Ethan's eyes. He wasn't mourning his father. He was tallying numbers, weighing rumors, anticipating what might soon be his. It wasn't paranoia. I knew that look. I had seen it before, long ago, when Richard tried to instill responsibility in him by making him work a summer job at one of the warehouses. Ethan had hated every second of it, sneering at the dust and sweat, while muttering about how all this would be mine anyway. I had brushed it off back then, convinced that youth made boys arrogant, but that life would teach him humility. That illusion dissolved the moment I saw him at the funeral, lips pressed thin, his mind already racing ahead to the $10 million fortune that lay behind lawyers' doors. The service ended as twilight settled. Guests lingered, their conversations shifting from somber to speculative. Some spoke of the empire Richard had left behind, multiple properties, his share in the company, the investments. Whispers carried numbers like sparks on the wind. 10 million, maybe more. Each word seemed to feed Ethan's hunger, his posture straightening, his eyes gleaming with entitlement. He didn't hear condolences. He heard confirmation of his imagined inheritance. When the last of the mourners departed and the house fell into quiet, I thought we might finally share a moment of mother and son, two people bound by the same loss. I hoped foolishly that grief would peel away his selfish layers and remind him of love. But when I found him in the living room, sitting on Richard's old leather chair as if he had already claimed the throne, the look he gave me chilled me to the bone. "Leave the house, Mom." His voice was flat, almost casual, as if he were asking me to pass the salt. I froze. Surely I had misheard. My mind, fogged by exhaustion, replayed the words again and again, but their meaning remained mercilessly clear. He leaned forward, his hands gripping the armrests, like a king securing his crown. "Dad wanted me to have everything," he continued, his tone sharpened with certainty. "The house, the money, the businesses, it's mine now. You don't need all this. You're old. You'll be fine somewhere smaller. Maybe an apartment." Shock tore through me, not like a single blade, but like 1,000 shards piercing at once. This was my son, the boy whose first steps I had cheered, whose scraped knees I had kissed, whose future I had prayed for every night. And now he sat before me, carving me out of the life I had built with his father, erasing me as if I were a burden to be discarded. I tried to speak, but my throat constricted. My hands trembled against the folds of my black dress, still damp from tears shed at the cemetery. I wanted to scream, to shake him, to remind him of the years of sacrifice, of the nights Richard and I stayed awake worrying about his education, his health, his reckless choices. But all that spilled from me was a whisper. "How can you say this, Ethan? Your father is barely in the ground." His expression didn't soften. If anything, his eyes hardened, reflecting not grief but calculation. "Dad knew I'd handle things better," he replied. "He didn't want you clinging to the past. You'll see, it's better this way." Better for whom? The words I wanted to throw at him remained trapped behind the ache in my chest. My heart pounded not only with sorrow, but with the dawning realization that Richard's death had unleashed something monstrous in our son. Grief should have united us. Instead, it exposed the rot that had festered in him all along. That night, I sat alone in my bedroom, staring at the empty side of the bed where Richard once lay. The silence was suffocating. The memory of Ethan's command, "Leave the house, Mom," reverberated like a curse. It wasn't just a demand for property. It was a rejection of me, of my place in the family, of everything Richard and I had worked to preserve. And in that moment, I realized the battle for Richard's legacy wasn't about money. It was about dignity, respect, and the very bond between a mother and her child. Ethan had drawn the first line in the sand, and whether I was ready or not, I would have to decide how to stand on the other side of it. Ethan's greed did not bloom suddenly at his father's deathbed. It had been verminating for years, like weeds pushing through cracks in the foundation of our family. Richard saw it early. He used to say, "Our son is clever, but he wants the fruit without planting the tree." And he was right. Ethan admired the shine of wealth, but despised the sweat that produced it. As a child, he was never satisfied with toys or games, unless they were the newest or the most expensive. At birthday parties, he would compare his gifts to those of his friends, and if he found his wanting, he sulked until Richard replaced it with something grander. When other boys were chasing balls across muddy fields, Ethan was polishing shoes he had begged me to buy. Designer shoes that looked ridiculous on a 10-year-old. His sense of value was warped from the beginning, not measured in effort, not in kindness, but in the size of a price tag. Richard tried, in his quiet, steady way, to correct this. He believed discipline could shape a boy who had too much too soon. One summer, when Ethan was 16, Richard placed him in the warehouse of his company. "Let him sweat," he told me. "Let him feel what it means to earn $1 before he spends one." I remember watching Ethan leave that morning, his jaw tight with resentment. He returned by evening with blistered hands and fury in his eyes. "Do you want me to be a laborer?" He spat, slamming his work gloves on the table. "This isn't who I am, Mom. I'm meant for more." But more to Ethan never meant creating, building, or striving. It meant shortcuts. He dropped out of every responsibility that didn't offer immediate reward, convinced that his father's empire was a guarantee of comfort. Richard saw the storm forming, but I think he hoped love and time might redirect it. I, too, wanted to believe Ethan's arrogance was a phase, that maturity would bring gratitude. But arrogance, fed and unchallenged, hardened into entitlement. Then came Monica. She entered Ethan's life like perfume, intoxicating at first, then suffocating once it lingered too long. Monica had a face that turned heads and a voice that dripped with suggestion. She carried herself as though life owed her luxury, and she found in Ethan a willing accomplice. Where Richard had tried to teach humility, Monica whispered indulgence. She praised his ambitions not for their substance, but for their glitter. I remember one dinner vividly. Richard mentioned the importance of investing wisely, of keeping one's lifestyle modest until the foundation was unshakable. Ethan rolled his eyes, but it was Monica who spoke, leaning back in her chair with a smirk. "Life is short," she said. Why work yourself to the bone when you already have everything waiting? You should be enjoying it now. Cars, trips, whatever you want. That's what rich people do." She said it as though it were gospel truth, and Ethan nodded like a disciple at her sermon. From then on, her influence only deepened his discontent. They scrolled through websites of exotic vacations while bills went unpaid. They test drove sports cars, not with savings in hand, but with expectations that one day soon the keys would fall into Ethan's lap simply because of his surname. I watched with growing dread as they cultivated a life built on imagined riches, each day more detached from reality. It was not just their desires that cut me, it was the way they saw me. To them, I was not a mother grieving her husband of decades, but a stumbling block standing between them and the fortune they thought was theirs by right. My tears, my memories, my loneliness, all were invisible to Ethan when Monica's voice was in his ear. She fueled the fire of his entitlement, whispering poison until he looked at me not with love, but with resentment. The humiliation was sharper than grief. When I should have been surrounded by compassion, I was surrounded by suspicion. Every glance Ethan cast toward me seemed to measure how long until I relinquished control. Every smile Monica offered was laced with calculation, her eyes flicking over the furniture, the jewelry, the property deeds stacked in the safe. They circled me like vultures waiting for the last breath of my authority. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to hate them entirely, not then. Beneath my anger, there was a stubborn kernel of hope that Ethan might still remember who he was before greed consumed him. I remembered his boyhood laugh, the way he once clung to my hand in crowds, the letters he wrote me from summer camp when he was too young to hide affection. But whenever I searched for that boy in his eyes, all I found was hunger, the kind that devours everything and calls it destiny. Monica made sure of it. Her whispers promised him a life without restraint. Luxury cars gliding through city lights, penthouse suites with ocean views, parties where they could flaunt their wealth before others. It was a vision tailor-made for Ethan's vanity, and it turned him against the very values Richard had fought to instill. So while I mourned my husband, Ethan mourned nothing but the delay of his imagined inheritance. I stood in black, my heart split open, and my son, my only son, looked past me to the dollar signs he believed were his birthright. That, more than death itself, was the wound I carried. Not that Richard was gone, but that his legacy had been twisted into a weapon aimed at me. It was a Thursday evening, gray and unremarkable, when Ethan and Monica arrived with their suitcases. The air outside still carried the damp chill of late spring rain, and the house smelled faintly of Richard's cologne, the one that lingered on his jackets I had not yet had the courage to pack away. I was in the living room, surrounded by silence, when the door opened. Their entrance was abrupt, purposeful, and it felt less like family returning home and more like invaders claiming territory. Monica walked in first, her heels clicking sharply against the hardwood, a sound too loud for the house that once echoed with children's laughter. Her suitcase wheels scraped across the threshold. Behind her came Ethan, shoulders squared, jaw locked, dragging his luggage with the authority of someone convinced he had just crossed into his rightful kingdom. His eyes swept the room, not with nostalgia, but with inspection, as though assessing how quickly it could all be reshaped to fit his image. I rose from the couch, my heart pounding. Before I could ask why they had come unannounced, Ethan lifted a hand and pointed toward the door with the same cold detachment one might use to dismiss a stranger. "Pack your things, Mom," he said. His tone was clipped, factual, as though announcing the weather. "It's my house now." For a moment, the world tilted. My knees weakened, and I clutched the armrest to steady myself. His words carried no hesitation, no guilt, only possession. My own son stood before me, in the home where I had rocked him to sleep as a baby, where his first drawings still hung framed in the hallway, and stripped me of belonging with a single sentence. The house around me pulsed with memories. The kitchen where Richard and I had danced quietly after dinner, our bare feet sliding across the tiles. The stairs where Ethan once sat with scraped knees, tears streaming down his cheeks as I bandaged him. The walls still bore faint pencil marks from when I had measured his height each year, his excitement spilling into squeals when he grew another inch. Every corner of that house was layered with our history, but in Ethan's eyes, none of it mattered. He saw only property, title, inheritance. Monica stood at his side, arms crossed, lips curved into the faintest smirk. She didn't need to speak. Her presence was enough to remind me that this was no spontaneous cruelty. She had rehearsed this moment with him, whispered it into being. She wanted the house, the symbols of wealth, the victory of conquest, and she was willing to strip me of my dignity to achieve it. I tried to find words, but my throat felt as though it had been clamped shut. Hatred flickered inside me, fierce and consuming, yet I kept my face composed. The urge to lash out, to shout that the house was mine, that he had no right, surged through me. But something stronger held me back, a quiet, deliberate restraint born of years of Richard's influence. Richard had always said, "The louder a fool shouts, the clearer his foolishness becomes." Let silence shame them more than anger ever could. So I stayed silent. I let Ethan mistake my trembling for weakness rather than control. He thought he had won, that I was too old, too fragile, too broken to resist. He could not see the storm building behind my eyes. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. I could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the sharp intake of Monica's breath as she shifted impatiently. Ethan misread my stillness as surrender. His shoulders relaxed, his jaw unclenched, and he began walking through the living room, touching the furniture as if it already belonged to him. His fingers traced the edge of Richard's armchair, the one where my husband spent long evenings reading. He leaned against it casually, defiling its memory with his arrogance. "You'll find somewhere else," he said, his back turned to me. "An apartment, maybe. Something manageable." He said it the way one speaks of a stray animal that should be relocated. My chest burned. Rage pressed against my ribs, begging to erupt, but I pressed it down. To speak then, to argue, would have given him the satisfaction of seeing me desperate. Instead, I lowered myself slowly back onto the couch, hands folded tightly in my lap, and watched him. If he noticed the fire in my eyes, he ignored it. Inside, my thoughts raged like thunder. How dare he? How dare the boy I carried for 9 months, the boy I fed, the boy I defended, reduce me to an intruder in my own home? Hatred seared through every memory of his childhood. The first day of school, his awkward teenage years, the college tuition paid from Richard's long hours. All of it twisted now, turned sour by the venom of his entitlement. But still, I gave him nothing. My silence became my weapon. Let them think I was defeated. Let Monica revel in her little smirk. Let Ethan strut through the halls, blind to the truth. Because beneath my calm exterior, something irreversible had shifted. He had cast me out in his mind, but in doing so, he revealed himself not as heir, not as son, but as stranger. And a stranger could never truly claim the heart of this house. So I sat in my own living room, surrounded by ghosts of the life I had built, and allowed him to believe he had erased me. The hatred in my chest glowed like coal, quiet but burning, and I vowed, without words, that this was not the end. The day of the will's reading felt heavier than the funeral itself. At least the funeral had been about Richard's life, his laughter, his achievements, the man he had been. This day was about what he left behind, and whether those who claimed to love him would honor his wishes or corrupt them with greed. The lawyer's office was a solemn place, paneled with dark oak, the smell of leather and paper thick in the air. Richard had chosen his attorney well, a man named Mr. Callahan, whose silver hair and steady hands carried the weight of decades of experience. He was not the sort to be intimidated or manipulated, and I silently thanked Richard for that foresight. I sat stiffly in the high-backed chair, clutching my handkerchief, my pulse quickening with every shuffle of papers on Callahan's desk. Ethan and Monica sat opposite me, too close together, their bodies angled in silent alliance. Ethan wore a suit that fit him poorly, as though borrowed for the occasion. His tie was loose, his posture smug, and the smirk on his lips told me everything. He believed this was the moment the world bent in his favor. Monica leaned in toward him, her manicured hand resting on his arm. She whispered something, and though I couldn't hear the words, I saw the gleam in her eyes. They had likely spent the night before plotting their future, choosing cars, vacations, maybe even discussing selling the house as if it were already theirs. The arrogance of youth, the arrogance of greed, it radiated off them like heat. Callahan cleared his throat, commanding the room. This is the last will and testament of Richard M. Hale. His voice was firm, official, each syllable slicing the air like a gavel striking wood. My heart thundered. Richard's name spoken aloud in that room made my grief surge again. But beneath the grief lay a deeper current of dread. I didn't know exactly what Richard had arranged. We had spoken in general terms, but he kept the details private, saying only, "Don't worry. I've made sure you're protected." Ethan leaned forward, his smirk widening, eyes fixed on the lawyer, as if he were a dealer about to slide him a winning hand of cards. Callahan began with the formalities, expressions of love for his family, acknowledgments of friendships, donations to charity. Then he turned the page, and the real matter began. "To my beloved wife, Margaret," he read, "I leave full authority over my estate, including all properties, businesses, financial accounts, and personal assets, totaling an estimated value of $10 million. She shall act as custodian of these holdings, with sole discretion over their use and distribution." The words hit Ethan like a blow. The smirk froze on his face, then faltered. His shoulders stiffened. He blinked once, then again, as though trying to clear his ears of a sound he refused to accept. Monica's hand slipped from his arm. Callahan continued, his tone unwavering. "To my son Ethan, I leave the opportunity of inheritance under specific conditions. He shall inherit only upon demonstrating responsibility, integrity, and respect toward his mother, Margaret. Until such time, all assets remain under her control. Should he fail to meet these conditions, the estate shall pass according to her wishes." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the tick of the clock on the wall, each second puncturing the room like a needle. Ethan's face drained of color, the pale of disbelief spreading across his cheeks. His mouth opened, then closed again. The words stuck like thorns in his throat. Fury began to kindle in his eyes. The arrogance that once inflated his every gesture cracked like glass, exposing the raw, bitter anger beneath. He had expected to walk out of that office a millionaire, free to indulge every desire. Instead, he had been handed a mirror reflecting the truth. He was unworthy. Monica shifted uncomfortably, her lips tightening. She masked it quickly, but not before I saw the flash of calculation in her eyes. She had tied herself to Ethan for his promise of wealth, not for the burden of patience. Ethan finally found his voice, a low growl pressed through clenched teeth. "This is a mistake. Dad wouldn't. He wouldn't humiliate me like this." His fists balled on the table, knuckles white. Callahan met his gaze, calm as stone. Your father's instructions were explicit. He wanted to ensure that what he built would be preserved, not squandered. This is his will, Mr. Hale. Not a suggestion. Ethan turned his fury toward me then, his glare sharp enough to cut. His lips trembled as though he might lash out, but the weight of the lawyer's authority restrained him. Still, the hatred in his eyes was unmistakable, directed not at the paper, not at Richard, but at me. To him, I was the gatekeeper, the obstacle, the thief who had stolen what he believed was his birthright. I sat straighter in my chair, though my heart hammered in my chest. For the first time since Richard's passing, I felt something other than grief. I felt vindicated. Richard had seen the danger. He had not been blinded by fatherly affection. He had recognized Ethan's flaws and protected me from them. The reading ended without further protest, though the tension in the room crackled like a storm about to break. Ethan stormed out first, Monica trailing behind him, her heels striking the floor in agitated rhythm. I remained seated, staring at the will on the desk, tears threatening but never falling. Richard had left me more than money. He had left me his trust, his faith that I would carry the weight of the family, even against our own son. It was a heavy burden, but at that moment I carried it with pride. The evening was quiet, too quiet, as though the house itself sensed the storm that was about to break. I had barely stepped through the doorway when Ethan appeared, his face flushed with anger, his movements sharp and deliberate. The dining room lights glowed above the polished mahogany table where countless family meals had once taken place. Birthday cakes, holiday dinners, late-night laughter. But that night, the table became an arena. I set down my purse, bracing myself. Ethan was already there, waiting. His jaw was clenched, eyes blazing with a fury that seemed older than him, a fury fed by greed and humiliation. Monica was nowhere in sight. This confrontation was his alone. Without warning, he slammed his fist on the table. The sound reverberated through the room, rattling the crystal glasses in the cabinet. "Give me my money, Mom," he snarled, his voice low but shaking with rage. "You don't need it. You're old." The words sliced through me. Not just cruel, but dismissive, erasing my worth with the ease of a butcher cutting meat. I had carried him inside me, nursed him through sickness, worried through sleepless nights, and now he reduced me to nothing more than an obstacle in the way of his fortune. My chest tightened, but not with sorrow. This time, it was anger. I met his glare across the table, my hands gripping the back of a chair until my knuckles whitened. "You think age makes me useless?" I asked, my voice steady, though the fury beneath it threatened to crack. "You think because your father is gone, I have no strength left in me? You're wrong, Ethan. Dead wrong." But he wasn't listening. He leaned forward, his palms pressed against the table as though staking a claim. "Dad built all this for me. I'm his son. It's mine by right. You're clinging to it because you can't let go, because you're afraid of being left with nothing." His words came out in a torrent, each one dipped in venom. I felt the blood rise in my face, but I did not look away. "Your father built this with his own hands," I said, my tone sharp as glass. "And he entrusted it to me, not you. Do you know why? Because he knew you'd squander it. He knew you'd rather demand than earn, rather destroy than build. You call it your birthright, but you haven't lifted a finger to deserve a single penny." For a moment, silence. Ethan's lips parted, his breath uneven, his face twitching with disbelief that I had dared to speak to him so directly. Then came the explosion. "You think you're better than me?" he shouted, his voice breaking the air like a whip. "You think you can stand there, after everything Dad left, and act like you're the one in control. You don't even know what to do with it." I slammed my hand flat on the table, the crack echoing back at him. Enough. My voice rose, not as a plea but as a command. I am your mother, and as long as I live, you will not treat me like a thief in my own house. You will never see a cent while you treat me this way. The room went still. Ethan froze, stunned by the fire in my words. It was the first time he saw me not as the grieving widow he believed he could intimidate, but as a barrier he could not easily break. His arrogance faltered, replaced for a brief flicker with uncertainty. He tried to recover, his expression contorting back into defiance, but it was too late. The balance had shifted. He realized, even if only for a second, that I was not his victim. I was his opponent. The air between us was thick, electric. I could hear the faint hum of the chandelier above us, the creak of the wood beneath my hand, the rapid thud of my own heart. Every detail of the room felt charged, transformed into witness of a battle fought not with fists, but with words and willpower. Ethan sank into the chair across from me, his movements jerky, his jaw grinding. He muttered something under his breath, too low for me to catch, but the venom in his tone carried across the table. His eyes darted to the cabinets, the paintings, the silverware, everything that screamed of wealth, and then back to me, as though measuring the distance between what he wanted and the woman who now stood in his way. I did not flinch. I stood tall, every muscle taut, my voice still resonating in the space between us. "You will learn respect," I said quietly, "or you will learn loss. But you will not break me, Ethan. Not now, not ever." He didn't respond. The silence that followed was louder than his shouts, heavier than his fist on the table. He had tested me, expecting submission, and instead he had met resistance. The war at the dinner table ended not with compromise, but with the knowledge that the lines had been drawn. That night, as I cleared the untouched place settings and stacked the dishes with shaking hands, I felt no victory, only a grim clarity. My son had declared war against me, and I had answered. The home that once united us had become a battlefield, and every meal, every word, every glance would now be a skirmish in the fight for what Richard had left behind. Ethan did not retreat after the war at the dinner table. His pride would not allow it. He saw my resistance not as a warning but as a challenge, and in his arrogance he convinced himself he could break me through force. It began with sharp words, then escalated into tactics meant to humiliate and intimidate me. But with every strike, he struck only himself. The first blow came in the form of a lawsuit. Papers arrived at my door, crisp and heavy with legal threats. Ethan claimed I was mismanaging the estate, that Richard's fortune should pass directly to him. I remember the sting of humiliation as I unfolded the documents, the stark letters accusing me of fraud. To be dragged into court by my own son was a wound deeper than any words he had spoken at home. Yet when I showed the papers to Mr. Callahan, the lawyer Richard had trusted for decades, he only shook his head. "Your husband was meticulous," he said. He saw this coming. Richard had left no loopholes, no cracks through which Ethan could crawl. Every business contract, every property deed, every clause in the will had been fortified. Ethan's lawsuit collapsed in court before it could gather strength, dismissed almost as quickly as it was filed. The humiliation was his, not mine. But that small defeat only sharpened his fury. Next came the threats. He began to call late at night, his voice laced with venom. "You'll regret this," he hissed through the phone. "I'll drag your name through the mud. Everyone will see you're not fit to hold Dad's legacy." His words were meant to frighten me, to rattle my resolve. At first, my hands trembled when the phone rang, but over time, I realized something. His threats were hollow. They were the cries of a child denied candy, not the roar of a man in control. So he changed his methods. At family gatherings, holidays, birthdays, dinners where cousins and aunts filled the room, he began his campaign of public humiliation. He raised his voice so all could hear, painting me as selfish, as a miser clutching wealth that should have gone to him. "She's living off my inheritance," he declared one Thanksgiving, stabbing a carving knife into the turkey as though it were me. "She's choking on money while I'm left with nothing." The room had gone silent, all eyes darting between us. I felt the heat of shame rise to my cheeks, but I would not give him victory. Calmly, I folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and looked directly at him. "Your father's money is not your toy, Ethan, and I am not your servant." My voice carried, steady and unshaken. The relatives looked down at their plates, uncomfortable but knowing the truth. That day, Ethan lost more than the argument. He lost their respect. His desperation grew, and with it, his recklessness. He poured what little savings he had into legal fees, filing appeal after appeal, each dismissed with the same cold efficiency. He sold possessions to cover debts. His car, his watches, even the apartment furniture. But the more he clawed, the more he lost. And I, silently, steadily, managed what Richard had left behind. The businesses were no easy task. They required long hours, decisions that weighed heavily, negotiations with men who had once dealt only with Richard. Some doubted me at first, assuming I was too fragile, too inexperienced. But as quarters passed and profits stabilized, as contracts renewed, and employees remained paid, doubt turned into respect. Even Richard's toughest partners admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that I had not only upheld his legacy, but strengthened it. Each small victory became a quiet defiance against Ethan's narrative. While he burned through money and credibility, I stood firm, proving that age was not weakness, that grief had not left me powerless. Friends who had once pitied me began to admire me. Relatives who had once murmured uncertainty began to defend me openly. And Ethan, watching from the sidelines, felt his world shrink. He had believed I would crumble, that the weight of widowhood and legal battles would drive me into retreat. Instead, I grew sharper, more resolute. I learned to read financial reports late at night, studied contracts with a magnifying glass, attended board meetings where my voice carried authority. I wore Richard's strength like armor, and it guarded me against every blow. Ethan, meanwhile, became a man consumed by the fire he had lit himself. His eyes, once full of smug confidence, turned hollow with exhaustion. His voice, once booming with arrogance, cracked under strain. He was not only losing the battle against me, he was losing the war against his own pride. And as I watched him unravel from a distance, one truth became clear. Richard had been right. My husband had seen what our son would become if left unchecked. That was why he placed the estate in my hands, not as a burden, but as a shield. Ethan's downfall had begun not because I struck back, but because he could not accept the wall his father had built between him and the fortune he thought was his. The irony was brutal. In trying to prove himself stronger than me, he had only revealed how weak he truly was. Ethan had always believed Monica was his ally, the one person who understood him, supported his ambitions, and shared his hunger for wealth. He mistook her encouragement for loyalty, her flattery for love. What he never understood, what Richard had seen in her eyes from the very beginning, was that Monica's devotion was not to Ethan, but to the lifestyle she believed he could provide. When that illusion cracked, so did the marriage. At first, the decline was subtle. Ethan's lawsuits drained his accounts, legal fees mounted, appeals were denied, and one by one, the assets he once flaunted vanished. The luxury car Monica loved to parade through town was the first to go, repossessed when payments fell behind. She cried that evening, her hands clutching her face as though she had lost a child. "We'll get another," Ethan had promised, jaw tight, desperation hiding beneath his bravado. But the words rang hollow, even then. Next went the apartment furniture, sold off piece by piece to cover mounting debts. The sleek leather sofa, the glass dining table, the designer lamps Monica had insisted on buying, all gone, carted away by strangers who left the rooms bare and echoing. Monica grew restless, her frustration leaking into every word. "This isn't the life I signed up for, Ethan," she hissed one night, pacing the kitchen with her arms crossed. "You promised me better. You said your father's money would make us untouchable." Ethan, already humiliated by his failed battles in court, lashed out. "It's still mine," he snapped. "Mom can't keep it forever. She'll slip up. The money is ours. It has to be." But Monica no longer looked at him with belief. Her eyes, once sparkling when he made grand declarations, were now sharp with disappointment, scanning the cracks in the foundation of the life she had built with him. The final blow came not with words, but with absence. One morning, Ethan awoke to find her side of the bed cold. Her clothes were gone, her jewelry box empty, her phone disconnected. She hadn't left a note, only silence. By noon, the whispers reached him. Monica had been seen at the airport, boarding a flight to Miami on the arm of Victor Lang, a wealthy investor twice her age, known for his ruthless appetite for business and women alike. The tabloids later confirmed what the neighbors suspected. She had traded one sinking ship for another gilded yacht. The betrayal hollowed Ethan out. He had gambled everything on the belief that Monica's love was genuine, that together they would outwit me, strip the estate, and live in luxury. Instead, she revealed the truth with surgical precision. Her love had always been conditional, bound not to him, but to the fortune he dangled before her. When the fortune evaporated, so did she. I did not rejoice when I heard the news. Though a part of me felt the grim justice of it, another part, perhaps the mother in me, ached at the image of Ethan alone in that barren apartment, sitting on a floor where his furniture once stood, staring at the empty closet where Monica's dresses had hung. He had chosen her over family, over decency, over me, and now she had chosen someone else over him. Greed had been his compass, and it led him into betrayal. The shame was more than financial. It was social. The same relatives who once endured his rants at family gatherings now whispered about his humiliation. Old friends avoided his calls. Even business associates who had once tolerated him for Richard's sake began to distance themselves. No one wanted to be tied to a man abandoned by his wife and drowning in debt. Ethan, once so loud, so certain, became a figure of pity and ridicule. He moved into a small rented apartment on the edge of town, far from the neighborhoods where he once bragged about buying property. The building was dim, its halls narrow, its paint peeling. The rent consumed what little remained of his savings, and the unpaid bills piled on the counter like vultures circling a carcass. The electricity notices, overdue statements, collection letters, they gathered in stacks, each one a reminder of how far he had fallen. Neighbors saw him coming and going, shoulders hunched, his once proud stride replaced by a weary shuffle. He avoided eye contact, ashamed of the whispers that followed him. The man who once dreamed of penthouses and sports cars now counted coins for bus fare. The transformation was so complete, so merciless, that even those who despised him felt a flicker of pity. But I did not pity him, not fully, for I knew this was the cost of his choices. He had cast me aside, demanded my home, my dignity, as if they were his for the taking. He had chosen Monica, believing her to be the key to his empire. In the end, she proved to be the mirror of his own heart, shallow, greedy, and faithless. He had traded his family for greed, and greed had betrayed him back. There was no triumph in watching him crumble, only the cold clarity of truth. Richard had always warned that shortcuts breed weakness, that love built on greed cannot endure. Ethan had ignored those lessons, and now the lessons had devoured him. The rain came heavy that evening, lashing against the windows as if the sky itself wanted to tear the world open. Thunder rumbled low, like a distant growl, and the air was thick with the kind of chill that seeps into bones. I sat in the living room, the only light a dim lamp beside Richard's chair, reading reports from the company I had inherited, my pen moving slowly across the pages. The sound of rain should have been soothing, but instead it carried a weight, an unease that settled over me. Then came the knock. It wasn't sharp or confident. It was hesitant, almost weak, a sound that seemed to falter between beats of thunder. For a moment, I wondered if I had imagined it. But when it came again, softer this time, something inside me tightened. No one knocked on my door at that hour, and certainly not in such a way. I rose, my steps careful, my heart quickening with every creak of the floorboard. When I opened the door, the sight before me stole my breath. Ethan. But not the Ethan I had last faced, not the arrogant son who once slammed his fist on my dining table, nor the man who paraded Monica at his side like a trophy. This was a different figure altogether, unkempt, broken, trembling in the rain like a boy lost in a storm. His hair clung to his forehead, matted and unwashed. His clothes, once tailored and pressed, now hung loose and wrinkled, damp from the downpour. His face was hollow, eyes sunken, and those eyes, once blazing with entitlement, were now empty, stripped of everything but desperation. Before I could speak, he collapsed onto his knees on the porch. The sound of his body hitting the wood echoed louder than thunder. He reached for my hands, clutching them with trembling fingers, his skin cold, his grip weak but urgent. His voice cracked, broken by sobs that barely held shape. "Mom," he choked out, rainwater and tears indistinguishable on his face. "I'm sorry. Please, forgive me. I was wrong." The words fell from his lips like shattered glass, jagged and cutting. For a moment, I could not move. My heart ached so deeply it felt as though it might split open. I saw before me not just the man who had betrayed me, not just the son who had tried to erase me from my own home, but also the boy I once knew, the boy who used to run barefoot through the yard, who clung to me when nightmares woke him, who laughed with a light that could brighten the darkest day. That boy flickered behind the ruin of the man, like a candle guttering in the wind. I bent down slightly, searching his face, trying to reconcile the image of the child I had raised with the man who now knelt before me in disgrace. His pride was gone. The armor of arrogance that had once shielded him was shattered. What remained was raw and fragile, a hollow vessel emptied by greed, betrayal, and loss. The rain poured harder, soaking us both as we stood there, but neither of us moved. His tears mingled with the storm, and his words, "I'm sorry, I was wrong," echoed in my ears with the weight of years. He repeated them, each time more desperate, as if the repetition itself might absolve him. "Please," he begged, his voice trembling. "I'd lost everything. Monica left me. I don't have anyone else. I don't have anywhere to go. I need you, Mom. I need you." Each confession twisted the knife deeper. This was the same son who once looked at me with disdain, who told me to pack my things and leave my home, who had tried to humiliate me in front of family. And yet here he was, broken, kneeling in the rain, begging for the very love he had scorned. I felt the swell of conflicting emotions rise in me: anger, sorrow, compassion, even a grim satisfaction. But above all, I felt the undeniable ache of motherhood. No matter how deep the wounds he had carved into me, No matter how cruel his words had been, a part of me could not help but see him as my child. That bond, though battered, could not be erased. Ethan, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the storm. His name trembled on my lips, heavy with years of disappointment and love intertwined. He lifted his eyes to mine then, and what I saw broke me. Gone was the arrogance, the sneer, the defiance. In its place was the hollow gaze of a man stripped bare, a man who had looked greed in the face and been devoured by it. He was no longer the son who demanded, who threatened, who schemed. He was only my son, the boy who had lost his way, who had fallen further than I ever imagined, and who now clung to me as though I were his last anchor in a world that had abandoned him. And in that moment, with the storm raging around us and his hands gripping mine, as though his life depended on it, I understood. Forgiveness would not erase the past, but perhaps it could carve a path forward. Yet even as my heart ached, I knew forgiveness was not a gift to be given lightly. It was a burden, a choice, and one that would weigh on me long after the rain ceased. For now I only stood there in the doorway, holding his trembling hands, staring into the hollow eyes of the man my son had become, and wondering if the boy I once raised could ever truly return. Ethan knelt before me, soaked in rain, his voice still trembling with apologies, his fingers clinging to mine as if I were the last rope keeping him from sinking completely. I could have turned him away. Every cruel word, every betrayal, every humiliation he had inflicted on me gave me reason enough to shut the door and let him face the emptiness he had created for himself. Justice was already mine. I had survived his greed, endured his contempt, and stood tall while he crumbled. In that moment, victory was in my grasp. But as I looked down at him, hunched and trembling, Richard's words came back to me with the clarity of a bell struck in the night. Wealth means nothing if we lose family. He had said it so many times, at the dinner table, in late-night talks, when Ethan was still a boy. To Richard, money was only ever a tool, never the measure of a man. What mattered was the bond that held us together, fragile though it might be. I studied Ethan's face. Pride had been stripped from him, arrogance shattered. What remained was raw, pain, shame, and a desperate plea for acceptance. I remembered the boy he once was, chasing fireflies in the yard, laughing so hard his small body shook. I remembered the teenager who, despite his flaws, once confessed to me in a rare vulnerable moment that he feared never being good enough for his father. That fear had grown into bitterness, then greed, but it had started with something fragile, something human. Could that boy still be reached, or was I staring at a man too far gone? The choice weighed on me. Forgiveness was not a word spoken lightly. It was not the soft erasure of the past. Forgiveness was a burden, a deliberate act of opening wounds again in the hope they might heal differently this time. If I welcomed him back without condition, what would stop him from repeating his mistakes? If I cast him out, what would become of him? A son destroyed not only by his greed, but also by his mother's rejection. I thought of Monica, of how easily she had abandoned him when the money dried up. She had loved only the promise of wealth, never the man. But I was his mother. If I abandoned him too, who would be left to believe there was something in him worth saving? Slowly, I pulled him to his feet. His body was weak, his shoulders sagging, but his eyes clung to mine with a desperation that frightened me. I held his gaze, steady and unflinching, and spoke with the weight of a mother's final verdict. "I will help you, Ethan," I said. My voice did not tremble. "But not the way you expect. You will have no inheritance, no shortcuts, no easy wealth handed to you. If you want a future, you will rebuild it from the ground up. Honest work, earned respect. That is the only path left to you, and the only path to forgiveness. The words struck him harder than any rebuke I had ever given. His mouth opened as if to protest, but no sound came. He saw in my eyes that this was not a negotiation, not a plea for his cooperation. It was a decree. If he wanted redemption, he would have to sweat for it, suffer for it, claw his way out of the pit he had dug with his own hands. Inside me, conflicting currents swirled, anger that he had dragged us to this place, sorrow for the years lost, but also a faint, stubborn hope that perhaps this fall had finally broken the chains of entitlement binding him. Perhaps, stripped of pride, he might finally learn what Richard had tried so hard to teach him. I did not embrace him. I did not whisper that everything would be all right, because it wouldn't, not yet. The road ahead was steep, and whether he climbed it or collapsed upon it would depend on him alone. My role was not to carry him, but to stand as the gatekeeper, holding open the possibility of forgiveness, but demanding he earn his way through it. As I looked at him, shivering, hollow, defeated, I knew this was the hardest choice I had ever made, not because it was cruel, but because it balanced mercy with steel. A mother's heart longs to heal, to shelter, to protect. But true love, I realized, does not shield a child from consequences. True love demands transformation, even if it means watching them struggle. Go and prove yourself, I told him softly but firmly. Show me you can be more than greed. Show me you can be the man your father wanted you to be. Only then will you find forgiveness. Ethan nodded slowly, his face crumpling with the weight of my words. He clutched my hands once more, but this time not as a beggar seeking alms, more like a man clinging to the faint spark of hope he thought was lost. In that moment, I felt the shift. Justice was already mine, but now I chose something harder, something heavier. I chose to give him a chance. Not a gift, not a free path, but the hardest road of all, the road of redemption. Time has a way of reshaping people, sanding down their rough edges until what remains is something sturdier, more authentic. Months passed, and with them, the storms of Ethan's arrogance quieted. What once burned in him as greed cooled into humility, not because I demanded it, but because life forced it upon him. Today, Ethan works under me in Richard's company. The irony is not lost on me. Years ago, he scoffed at the very idea of labor, dismissing it as beneath him. Now his days begin early, his shirt pressed, his hands steady as he files reports, negotiates with clients, or studies the spreadsheets that used to bore him. No inheritance cushions him, no shortcuts smooth his path. Each dollar he earns comes from hours of honest work, not from entitlement. And I watch with quiet satisfaction as the boy who once tried to strip me of my dignity now learns the dignity of work itself. The inheritance remains untouched, locked away in the structures Richard built with such care. It waits, not as a prize to be handed over, but as a silent reminder. Wealth is not destiny, but responsibility. Ethan knows this now. He sees the fortune differently, not as a golden key to indulgence, but as a heavy weight he must prove himself capable of carrying. The hunger in his eyes has shifted. It is no longer the hollow hunger of greed, but the quiet hunger of determination. What I have gained is not merely the preservation of Richard's estate. It is something greater, something no amount of money could buy. I have regained respect. Respect for my son, who once called me weak and disposable, and now looks to me as the measure by which he must guide himself. Respect from Richard's business partners, who doubted me in the beginning, but now treat me as an equal in the world my husband built. Respect from myself, too, for I learned that my strength did not vanish with Richard's death. It lived within me, waiting to be claimed. There are days I see Ethan in the office, head bent over his work, and I think of the boy he was. The boy who sat at our kitchen table, sulking because his allowance was smaller than he wanted, The boy who rolled his eyes when Richard told him to work in the warehouse. The boy who thought love and wealth were the same thing. That boy nearly destroyed himself, nearly destroyed us both. But today in his place I see a man scarred by his mistakes, humbled by loss, but slowly, steadily becoming the son Richard had always hoped for. It would be a lie to say the past does not linger. Sometimes, late at night, I remember his words. "Leave the house, Mom. It's my house now." They cut as deeply now as they did then, and perhaps they always will. But I have learned that justice is not vengeance. Justice is not watching him suffer or fall. Justice is seeing him change, seeing him rise again from the wreckage of his own choices, not as a conqueror, but as a man shaped by humility. My satisfaction lies not in destroying my son, but in witnessing his growth. To see him show up on time each morning, to see him take instructions without complaint, to see him offer respect without being asked, that is victory. It is the quiet kind of victory, the kind that restores rather than shatters. Justice was never about money. $10 million may impress outsiders, but it cannot heal a family. What mattered was dignity. Mine, reclaimed when I refused to be erased, and his, rebuilt when he finally learned that respect cannot be inherited, only earned. Richard's legacy lives not in the numbers written on a balance sheet, but in the lessons that legacy forced us to confront: discipline, respect, and the unshakable bond of family, even tested to its breaking point. Sometimes, as I walk through the office halls, I feel Richard's presence with me. I imagine him standing in the doorway, his arms crossed, a quiet smile on his lips as he watches Ethan at work. He would not gloat, would not shout, "I told you so." That was never his way. He would only nod, satisfied that his faith in me, and in the possibility of Ethan's redemption, had not been misplaced. And I, too, feel that satisfaction. Not the fleeting satisfaction of revenge, but the lasting peace of justice restored. I did not lose myself in bitterness. I did not abandon my son, though he abandoned me. I chose the harder path, the path of patience and resolve, and in the end, it bore fruit. Ethan is not yet the man he could be. His journey is far from complete. But for the first time in years, I see the possibility of pride in him, not pride in wealth, but pride in effort, in resilience, in dignity. And that, more than any inheritance, is the legacy Richard and I wanted to leave behind.